Okay. Shri Matre Namaha. So let's begin our class today, again, as always, with the opening mantras. So come to your optimal position with the spine being straight. And close your eyes. And if you know, please chant along with me. Namo Devyai Mahadevyai Shivayai Satatam Namaha Nama Prakrityai Bhadrayai Niyatah Pranatasmatam Om Jayanti Mangala Kali Bhadrakali Kapalini Durga Kshama Shiva Dhatri Swaha Swadha Namostute Om Sarva Mangala Mangalye Shive Sarvartha Sadhike Sharanye Trayambake Devi Narayani Namostute. So welcome back to our class, and let's talk about Bagalamukhi. So at this point in our sadhana of the Mahavidyas, we have encountered our various shadows. We have learned to discern between the I self and the self. And in the last class, we met Dhumavati. Dhumavati is the one that takes us to the great void, and often through the disabling phase of the dark night, quite often. And if our sadhana has gone as planned, that is the caveat. Now we come face to face with the last three Mahavidyas. And of these three, Bagalamukhi is the fiercest. The next two that we are going to meet are subtler in their fierceness. So Bagalamukhi is not a very well-known goddess outside of certain traditions. So let's examine her origins for a bit. So if you look at the root of the name Bagalamukhi, so it comes from two words. Bagla is a distortion of the root Valga. So and a Valga means a bridle or a bit that goes in a horse's mouth. And Mukhi refers to face. So Bagalamukhi refers to the goddess whose face has the power to hypnotize or to control, just like the bit in the horse's mouth controls the horse. So there are several different accounts of her origin, before she becomes part of the Dasha Mahavidya. So there is this story, for instance, in the Puranas, where there is this great cosmic storm going on. Remember, in the last class, we talked about the pralaya that happens at the end of one yuga, or at the end of the kalpa, actually, which consists of the 4 yugas. And so there is this story that there is this, at the end of a kalpa, instead of the pralaya, there is this great cosmic storm, which threatens to basically annihilate everything in existence, including Lord Vishnu, who is the preserver or the sustainer of the universe. So, and he, not knowing who to turn to, he actually goes to a particular lake, a hidden lake in a particular plane of consciousness, and he immerses himself into this lake. And what is so special about this lake is that it is made of turmeric, the yellow spice. So he basically immerses himself into this, trying to invoke the goddess who is in that lake. And so what arises out of that turmeric lake is this yellow goddess, and her face is yellow, her clothing is yellow, everything from top to bottom with her is yellow. She is the color of that turmeric. And so she comes out of this water and grants Vishnu this boon of surviving through the cosmic storm, and she actually calms the storm. And she is known as Bagalamukhi because she has the ability to control the storm, just like a horse can be controlled by the bit. There is another story that I was narrating in the last class of the origin of Dhumavati. So you remember that story where Shiva and Parvati are off in a remote corner of the Himalayas, and Parvati gets hungry and she asks Shiva for some food, and he keeps ignoring her, whereby she gets furious and she just swallows him whole. And Shiva, of course, he pleads with her to kind of regurgitate him out, and she does. And when she does, he actually, it's in one version of the story, he actually splits her into two, and he says, as Bagalamukhi, you are going to be the fierce goddess that stuns, that controls the universe, and the smoke that comes out of that fierceness is going to be Dhumavati. So he basically splits her into two. That's one version of that story. And then there's another, like a third version of that story, and that has to do with the story of an asura. So you remember right in the beginning, we talked about the devas and the asuras. The devas are these forces of light, and the asuras are the forces of darkness, and they are perpetually at war, just like these forces are at war within us. And so there is one particular story where there is an asura called Madana. And it so happens that all of these asuras, actually, the reason that they become so powerful is that they have the ability for tapas. So remember in the class in Bhairavi, we talked about tamas and tapas. So what these asuras are not tamasic when it comes to spiritual practice. They have the ability to persevere. They have the courage and what it takes to actually persevere in spiritual sadhana. This is why, asuras, the great, well-known asuras such as Ravana, or any of the other asuras, even in the Mahabharata, for instance, they have great powers that are bestowed to them by one of the Trinity. Actually, it's either Brahma, Vishnu, or Shiva that gives them these powers because they are pleased with their ability for tapas, and they are pleased with that single pointedness that some of these asuras cultivate, which even the devas cannot. Right? So it's just that their priorities are all messed up. And so what they ask for turns out to be very selfish and greedy, and it's insatiable because they are asking for these powers that will make them invincible. And so they're not really thinking about the whole. But what pleases these great gods and goddesses to actually bestow boons upon the asuras is their capacity for tapas. And so imagine if they can gain that, what about us humans? Because we are not all dark. right? We don't have that kind of darkness that the asuras do. And if we cultivated that kind of tapas, it would take us to great places, right? It would elevate us in ways that we can't even possibly imagine. But what we lack is that tapas that these asuras have, they tend to have. So, for instance, just as a digression, Ravana, Ravana is the villain of the great epic Ramayana. So he is said to be this terrible asura. I mean, it's not even, there is no question about his, the atrocities and things that he inflicted upon people. But yet, he is considered, even now, across, kalpas, he is considered one of the greatest Shiva bhaktas. Okay, he is one of the greatest devotees of Lord Shiva. In fact, at many temples, including the Srividya temple in New York, where my guru is, we actually recite this Shiva Tandava Stotram that is composed by Ravana. Okay, so and a lot of hymns that praise Shiva, there will be a reference to Ravana as the this great Shiva who was worshipped by the great Ravana. So despite the fact that he was an asura, he is still considered to be one of the greatest Shiva bhaktas ever. So so that's like a little background on how these asuras get to have all these siddhis and these great powers, which then they misuse, and everybody else has to be rescued from them. So in this particular story, there is this asura called Madana, and he asks for this through his power of tapas, he asks for a boon where whatever he says comes true. So that is called Vak Siddhi. So he asks for that siddhi, or that particular superpower where he can inflict harm upon others just by saying the word. Okay, and he's given that power, and of course he goes to town with it and begins to harass all of creation with it. Because think about it, if you can just erase, right, populations off the planet just by saying the word, can you imagine that kind of power? So that's the kind of power he had. So and nobody can stop him. So he is just that invincible. And at that point, all the devas and all the gods, they get together and they invoke this great goddess Bagalamukhi, and to come and stop his siddhi, to actually take away his siddhi. So and of course, she is pleased by their prayers, and she appears in front of them, and she actually grabs his tongue. She defeats him in battle, and she grabs his tongue and she strikes his tongue with her mace, whereby that superpower is gone. She takes that away from him. And she's about to kill him when Madana, he has a change of heart. And he this is really, the turning point. And you can actually see how these things happen within us, right? Because just at the time when the ego is going to be, killed off, the ego just surrenders. And so that's exactly what happens here with him. And he says, I don't wish to live away from you, O Devi. Please keep me by your side always. Even if that means that you continuously strike my tongue and you inflict this harm on me, that's fine. I just want to be near you. And she relents. And this is why in the iconography of Bagalamukhi, you always see this asura sitting by her, and she is striking his tongue. So let's meditate on this great goddess Bagalamukhi. So if you have the stotram, the mantra from the today's recording, please pull that up. And I will show you a picture of Bagalamukhi here as we chant. So close your eyes and sit with your spine straight. Take a deep breath. And if you know this mantra, you can chant with me. Sauvarnasana samsthitam trinayanam pitanshu kollasini hema bhangaruchim shashanka mukutam sachampakasrugayutam हस्तैर्मुद्गरपाशवज्रवसनां संबिभृतिं भूषणैः व्याप्ताङ्गीं बगलामुखी त्रिजगतां संस्तम्भिनीं चिन्तये. I meditate on Bagalamukhi, who is seated on a golden throne, who has 3 eyes and is draped in yellow, who wears yellow clothes and whose limbs glow golden, who wears a garland that is yellow and the moon as her crown, who holds a club in one hand and in the other her opponent, she who is the paralyzer of the 3 worlds. Meditate now on Bagalamukhi. She's golden in complexion. And out of her you have the shimmering golden aura you can see all around her. She's absolutely radiant. And she's sitting on a golden throne, which is bright, shimmery. And in one hand, she has a golden mace. It's beautifully ornamented. And she's about to strike. And in the other hand, she's holding the tongue of a man clad in black. They're looking at each other. And even though her strike is fierce, she still has a smile of compassion. And even though he appears terrified, there is still awe on his face. At this point, all of creation is stilled. When her mace will strike the tongue, that's when the pace will pick up again. Just for that moment, there is absolute stillness. Just before she strikes his tongue, her clothes are glowing. Her whole form is glowing, bright, golden. And as soon as she strikes his tongue, the color changes subtly, becoming yellow, a bit duller. She has 3 beautiful eyes. Open, awake, blissful. Meditate on Bagalamukhi. When her mace is about to strike, Kali will stop. She'll pause momentarily. Bhairavi's beads stop moving. The blood pulsing out of Chinnamasta's neck will stop momentarily. Just momentarily, just for that instant, the only sound that can be heard in all of creation is Tara's primordial hum. And in this pause, Bhuvaneshwari blinks her eyes. Dhumavati's void pulls all of creation into it. And Tripura Sundari glows in all the triads of manifestation. All of creation rests in this moment when Bagalamukhi is about to strike. Take a deep breath. Come back to your body. Bow to Bagalamukhi. And open your eyes. So, all of creation rests in that moment when Bagalamukhi is about to strike the tongue of Madana, because the tempo, the rhythm of the cosmos is going to depend on this. The direction in which the cosmos is going to move is going to depend on this. What forms are going to come out of the formless is going to depend on this. So, what is about this striking power that is so significant in creation? What is that? So it's, see, whenever we try to stifle something, whenever we try to hold or we try to control something, there is a buildup of energy. There is a buildup of force because it is moving in a certain direction, and then you stop it. So the kinetic energy turns into potential energy. So in that potential energy, when it builds, it needs to find a direction. It needs to find this a new pathway for it to burst open and turn back into kinetic energy. So the backed up energy, when in that stillness, whatever is backed up, it just releases in all kinds of new ways in every moment, right? So in the way in which that's going to happen is going to determine the destiny of the universe and of our microcosm. So what is with all this yellow? See, look at the altar. It's all yellow. So there are yellow flowers, and there is the yellow fabric. And then you see the prominent inner triangles in the yantra. And then you have the stillness being depicted by this stopped clock. So Bagalamukhi is known as Pitambareshwari, the yellow goddess. So her complexion is yellow, as we saw in her meditation. She's clad in yellow clothes. And when an aspirant, when a sadhaka is asked to do her sadhana, then he or she is asked to wear yellow. So we are supposed to wear yellow, and then we are supposed to, for instance, if we are doing mantra sadhana of Bagalamukhi, then we are asked to use actually yellow beads made of turmeric in her sadhana. And so what is with yellow, right? Why yellow? So the Vedas talk about the supreme truth or Brahman as Hiranyavarna. So if you look at this Vedic hymn on, it's called Shri Suktam, and it's a hymn for the goddess Lakshmi or Shri. So it starts off as Hiranyavarnam Harinim Suvarna Rajatastrajam. So the very beginning of that hymn is, it starts off saying Hiranyavarnam Harinim Suvarna. So all different names for gold, golden in color. So the supreme truth or the self or Brahman, it descends as the triad of the physical, the mental, and the energetic. So remember all the different triads that the Tripura Sundari and Tripura Bhairavi occupy. So this is, yet another one of those triads. So when the Supreme descends into us, as us, then there are three aspects to us: the physical, the mental, and the energetic. And when this power, when the Supreme power descends into creation, it becomes overshadowed by the thinking mind. So, for instance, the higher intuitive power that each of us has becomes masked by this constant thinking and this the covering, so to speak, of the vasanas. So the golden glow of the supreme truth of Brahman or the self becomes yellow. So in that, it becomes dull from being gold to becoming yellow. So yellow is the color that, it can be used, for instance, in art. If you want to subdue the brightness of other colors, then you add yellow to it. And so the word in Sanskrit for this phenomenon of yellow doing that is pita. And pita means the one that saps the effects of others. So Bagalamukhi is this force that basically stuns or stops us in our tracks, and the brightness of the mind, so to speak, that is overshadowing, the brightness of the supreme truth, is dulled. So, and like Dhumavati, Bagalamukhi is worshipped extensively for attainment of various powers or siddhis. Like, even now you can see, if you do a Google search, you'll see, people are willing to do this, worship Bagalamukhi on your behalf to win conflicts, like lawsuits or debates or wars and things like that, because the belief is that she can stun the opponent's intelligence and or his or her tongue. So in the spiritual community, right, in the olden days, for instance, there used to be this issue, many of you are familiar with this, is if you belong to one path and then you have somebody else belonging to another path, then the supremacy of one path could be determined through this debate that went on between two people of two different paths. So ideally, both of them would be well versed with both the paths. Only then could they actually make these intelligent, hold these intelligent debates and conversations. So when that happened, when there was this intelligent conversation that was based on both people understanding both points of view, then that used to be called vada prativada. So that's one way of calling it a skillful debate. Now, there are other instances, even now, for instance, if you're trying to have a discussion on Facebook in various spiritual groups, you don't necessarily get vada prativada. They don't really necessarily get skillful debate, right? What we get is what is known as vitandavada. Vitandavada means this, this stubborn enforcing of one's own viewpoint without really understanding what the other viewpoint is, right? So in those situations, Bagalamukhi would be actually invoked to stun the opponent's tongue, and so in that way, she came to be known as the stunning power, the one that could strike the tongue of the enemy and have them momentarily lose the ability to express themselves. So in the imagery of Bagalamukhi, sometimes you see a swan. And even in Shakti Rising, that's how the artist depicted it. There is a swan on the throne on which she sits. So a swan in the Indian traditions is considered to be this divine bird. For instance, the swan is the favored vehicle of the goddess Saraswati. And so she travels around on a swan. So the significance of the swan is that it is thought to be this bird that has this extremely high discernment. It is able to, if you give it, for instance, they say, if you give it a mixture of milk and water, it can take in only the milk and leave the water. So it has that high ability to discern and between what serves it, or what is serving and what is non-serving, what is real and what is not real, what is the I self and what is the self. On the other hand, a duck is the opposite of a swan. So, even now we say a duck is a quack, right? Uh, Doctors who don't do such a great job are called quacks. Hopefully, I'm not one of them. But a duck it doesn't have that ability or that level of discernment. So, Bagalamukhi has the power to turn a swan into a duck. So, um, so this is the belief about Bagalamukhi, and so she is worshipped in order to get all these kinds of powers and so on. But actually, if you do her sadhana, you'll see that her true blessing is a gift that surpasses anything that you can possibly want in the world. It is any gains in the material world really don't compare to her gift. And so what is that? So Bagalamukhi actually represents the countless invisible pauses that determine the course of creation, right? So as creation unfolds, there are infinite possibilities in every step. So anything that you can possibly think of, any world event, any a climate change, any any social, cultural, or even in the family, an action before even before the action begins, there is a tiny little pause between wanting to do something, between will and knowledge, and really understanding what I need to do in order to make my will come true. So there is a pause there between will and knowledge. And then there is also a pause between knowledge and action. So there are countless tiny little pauses between will, knowledge, and action. And even once the action begins, between one step and the subsequent step, if you really observe closely, there are countless gaps. It may all seem like like a stream. So if you look at the old days when they would make these cartoons, they would draw these individual cartoons, and then they would be played on a reel. And but actually there were a stack of pictures or drawings, and they were made to look like a movie, but actually there was a tiny little pause between one and the other. So it's the same thing in our lives too. It seems like it's a continuous stream of things, but if you really have her grace, you'll be able to see that there's a pause from moment to moment. And so the completion of each cycle of that will, knowledge, and action is followed by a pause, and it's absolute silence there. And this determines the next cycle. So between making my decision to do something and actually carrying on that action, there is a pause. And how and whether or not I'm going to do something is going to determine, is going to be determined by whether I am going to stay in that pause and consider the consequences of my action, or ignore the pause and keep going. So my destiny really depends on the pause. It's just that I don't realize it. So Bagalamukhi is that radiant silence of this pause. And what is this pause? It is the silence of the witnessing awareness, or turiya. Remember that fourth state, that stateless state we talked about in the last class. So there is the waking state, the dreaming state, and then the deep sleep state. And all of these three states are superimposed on witnessing awareness. So it's like the paper on which all the words are written. So the turiya is Bagalamukhi. So it is in turiya that all phenomena arise, all experiences arise. And so she is that silence and that brilliant clarity of that witnessing awareness. And how can we access it? It's easily accessed as the gap between thoughts. It is that gap between choice and action. It is the gap between sleep and wakefulness. And if you really pay attention, actually, if you cultivate this kind of awareness, there is a pause between the dream state and the deep sleep state, and you can catch that. And from the deep sleep state, back to the dreaming state, you can catch that. From the dream state to the waking state, you can catch that. So that is Bagalamukhi. That gap, that silent, radiant, brilliantly clear witnessing awareness, which is Turiya, which is the self, is Bagalamukhi. So she is also that gap between breaths, right? Between the in breath and the out breath. So in the Shakti Rising book, for instance, I described this meditation right in the beginning of the book, which is one of the most well-known meditations of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. And that is to catch that gap between the in breath and the out breath, between the out breath and the in breath. And if you become really quiet and notice, there is actually also a gap between when your brain captures or registers a perception and cognizing it, understanding it. So it's not like as soon as you look at something, you are able to cognize it. There is a slight gap there. And it's a very tiny, minute gap, this is why it's so tricky, because it's such a minute gap. And what's so tricky about it is even though it is that in which everything occurs, it still remains hidden. It becomes that yellow because of that thinking mind. So that golden Hiranya Varna becomes Pita, Pitambara, because of that dulling and this constant, the veil that we have that I'll talk about in a bit. So why is this gap necessary or important? Because in this gap, there are infinite possibilities. So it is because we don't recognize this gap that we are driven to do the same kind of thing again and again. This is how our conditioning develops, because we haven't paid attention to that gap. So the grooves of habit and of conditioning and of our vasanas are formed because we don't understand that there is that freedom between moments, between experiences, all these different experiences I just described, where our destiny can be changed. So that swatantra, or that freedom, actually comes from catching that gap and recognizing that gap and making a different choice between what we are driven to do from our habit and what we can do from this free-flowing choice, the ability to make a choice that we have that doesn't come from that conditioning. So remember, we talked about free will and so on in a previous class. So this is how free will actually can be exercised. This is where the divine will can be exercised and can be recognized when we don't run after that the helpless kind of following along the grooves of conditioning. And that can only happen if we stay in that gap between two things. So one way to look at this is, at Bagalamukhi's action, for instance, is through the practice of asana, or these yoga postures, as well as pranayama. So if you look at hatha yoga practices, where there's a lot of emphasis on moving the body in certain ways, holding the posture in certain ways, and even holding the breath in certain ways. So in asana, for instance, what is going on is that we are stopping the flow of energy by holding a pose in a certain way. And when we release it, that energy actually flows into different kinds of nadis. So we stop the flow in those habitual nadis, and we allow the prana to flow in new nadis, in the new channels that were previously blocked. So that is how we develop flexibility. And that's how we develop strength. And that's how we develop that stability, by creating these new channels within the body. Right? And it's the same thing with pranayama, where we're trying to regulate our breath. And if you look at the Hatha Yoga practices, it's all about opening up these new channels within the body, the new energetic, subtle channels or the nadis in the body. And so if you look at some of the pranayama practices, there is a holding of the breath, for instance. So you breathe for a certain count and you hold it, and then you breathe out and you hold it. So, and or you breathe very fast and then you hold it, or you and then you can either breathe in and hold it, or breathe out and hold it, or and so many different combinations there of pranayama. So why are we doing that? Because the energy is flowing in one particular way. We stop it, then that stopping is Bagalamukhi. We stop it, and then so that that energy builds up. And when it builds up, it can flow in other channels, not in those same channels that it is used to flowing in. So, and it's the same thing with our minds. When we hold back from giving into our habitual patterns, then new pathways can be forged in the brains, in our brain. And so this force of holding back, this stillness, our ability to just stay still instead of reacting immediately, that changes our destiny, is Bagalamukhi's grace, because that's how our destinies can be changed. So Bagalamukhi's grace is actually the turning point in our sadhana, and it is the beginning of real awakening, because now whatever intellectual understanding we have is being converted into practice, into an actualization within this body mind. It is that, and sometimes we think that, and I've talked a lot about the knowledge being a block, right? The knowledge that we have about something, it becomes the constricting force, as we saw in Bhuvaneshwari's class. And so when that knowledge is stopped, because when you know something, so this is something that a lot of my patients get to hear from me, because I tend to see a lot of patients who have been on the spiritual path. So they know everything that I'm talking about, right? They have this very keen intellectual understanding of whatever it is that I'm saying. But that intellectual understanding is the very thing that is preventing them from actualizing it, from actually knowing it. Because when you know something, then it's like the cup, the teacup that is full. When it's already full, it can't be filled anymore. It needs to be emptied. So too with this intellectual understanding. In fact, this intellectual understanding is actually much more, this ignorance is much more of a problem than spiritual ignorance. So we really have to be cautious about this intellectual kind of knowledge gathering. And so Bagalamukhi is known as Vak Stambhanakari. So she's the one that paralyzes speech. So speech here refers actually to that faculty that facilitates that expression. And when we think of speech, we usually think of the production of the sounds by this complex mechanism we have between the brain and the vocal cords and the lungs and the whole respiratory apparatus that we have going on. But actually speech encompasses all expression, and including the process of thought, which arises from that knowledge, which is gained through our experience, which is gained through our learning, and this creation of memory and imagination. And what this does, what this collection of knowledge does, is it results in this automatic labeling of everything that arises in our experience. So remember how I said there is this gap between perception and cognition. And we don't recognize that. Why? Because of this automatic labeling that comes in. So You see something and it's already, you look at an object, oh, that's a tree. You haven't, even before that is registered in the brain and that cognition happens, we don't even recognize that gap. So this in this immediate, almost simultaneous labeling of that arising perception, there is a duality that is created, which is, the separation between that object which is being perceived, which is not me, and me, the subject that is perceiving, which is me. So that duality is created in that automatic labeling of the object or that experience that is arising in our perception. So it is this dualistic power that speech gives us, and by speech I mean this mental kind of labeling, and it is in this labeling, in this speech, in this power of speech, that both time and space come into existence. It's not there. It is created artificially, actually, by this knowledge that becomes speech. So, and how does that happen? But from our memory, which are thoughts about the past, and imagination, which are thoughts about the future. And then there are more thoughts that come out of this, which in the form of expression, about how a current experience should be, right? So pay attention to this as you go about doing this week's homework. So in every moment, in every experience, we have this kind of a standard of how that should be. And that's always in resistance to how it is. So there is that dichotomy that's created between what is and what we think it should be. And so we go about our day and our lives, our life basically with this how things should be, instead of immersing in what already is. And that what should be comes from that knowledge, from this intellectual stuff that we have collected in our learning and in our experience. So that discordance between what should be and what is creates this continuous conflict within us, right? Both internally and externally, it's that constant conflict. And this is what causes that constant war that goes on with ourselves, with others, with nature, with pretty much everything that we come across, because of this idea of how things should be. And so that's why, doing the work, Byron Katie's The Work, is so important. It's so magnificent because it shows us that dichotomy between what should be and what already is. And this issue of what should be is the effect of this speech. When I say speech, it is this effect of this more upstream kind of thought process, which comes from knowledge. And of course, this is what creates vasanas. Our should-bes are what create vasanas. And our vasanas actually permeate through these coverings that we have. And they are called the 5 sheets, or the Panchamaya Kosha, as it is called in Sanskrit. So in today's class, you will have a handout on the Panchamaya Kosha, on the 5 sheets. And please look through that, because I think it's really important that we understand this. So there are 5 sheets. So we think that we have one body, but actually we have 5 of them. And our vasanas actually permeate through all 5 of them, and they express themselves in the way we think, in the way we feel, in the way we act, and in the way we cognize, in the way we perceive. All of that is determined by our vasanas, which really permeate into these 5 sheets. So what are these koshas? So very briefly, and because you have a handout of this, there is the first one is called the physical sheath, or the Annamaya Kosha. Anna means food. And so the physical body is the first kosha. And the physical body is called Annamaya Kosha because it's nourished by food. So whatever it is that we eat, it becomes this body. So, and then more subtle than the inside, or really animating this physical body is the Pranamaya Kosha, or the energy body. And so this is where this, the subtle body is, where there are these channels, the nadis, through which the energy is flowing, and the energy goes to every single cell of the body, and it is what is making our hearts beat, and our intestines function, and our brains, and so on. So that is the Pranamaya Kosha. And then and this Pranamaya Kosha is actually driven by the next subtle layer, which is called the Manomaya Kosha, or the mind sheath. And so the mind sheath is where this perception is happening. The sense organs are actually registered, and this is where the memory is, and so on. And then so this is where we take in the world, and we come to a conclusion, and then this is what drives our action. So the Manomaya Kosha is what we think we are usually. It is this, we think we are the ones that are perceiving, and the ones that are sending out these signals to act in certain ways. And so this Manomaya Kosha is covering a more subtle body, or a kosha, called Vijnanamaya Kosha. And so the Vijnanamaya Kosha is the wisdom sheath. And the wisdom sheath it's called wisdom sheath because this is where the higher functions of discernment come in. So this is where we have the ability to choose between what serves us and what doesn't serve us. So if this kosha is not really very well developed, then we live primarily in that Manomaya Kosha, because we are just like, whatever comes in, we just come to a conclusion and then just go with that, and not have the ability to think through things and make intelligent choices. So it's also called the intellect sheath, or the buddhi is where is what this sheath is also called. And so the clearer that sheath, the clearer is our ability to perceive ourselves as who we really are. So that buddhi it's what clouds our ability to see that who we are is divine. So, and the final sheath is called the Anandamaya Kosha, or the bliss sheath. And this is where, this is the house of the causal body. And it is the sheath of bliss is what we all kind of absorb into every night in deep sleep. That's why deep sleep is so blissful. And as we have seen in previous classes, that causal body is where all our vasanas are. So it's blissful because when you go into it, you go into Dhumavati's void. So even though it's called, Anandamaya Kosha, or the bliss sheath, it is still a sheath. It's a subtlest layer. It's a subtlest covering of the self. And so we need to pierce through all these 5 sheaths in order to come to the self, which is covered by these sheaths, so to speak. So when we do the sadhana of the Mahavidyas, so the light of each goddess, as we have seen, basically opens us to the light of the next goddess. So, for instance, when we do Kali sadhana, it takes us, just pushes us from the shadow of linear time into that eternal now, and that opens us to Tara's vibration, right? The primordial vibration, which is that I am. And so when we discover this vibration, then non-clinging happens automatically, because when you're resting as that pristine vibration, there is nothing you can possibly want, because there is that wholeness, which is Tripura Sundari's light. And then when we are in that, in that non-clinging state, then surrender happens very naturally, which is Bhuvaneshwari's light. And then that just opens us to Bhairavi's grace of tapas, because then tapas becomes easy, and then we have this perseverance that goes on, which is Bhairavi's light. And when we have cultivated all of these, the different aspects of the light of the Mahavidyas, then that appropriate will, knowledge, action cycle is something that flows naturally from us. That appropriate cultivation of our sexual energy is Chinnamasta's light. And when we have come to that, then we are taken into Dhumavati's void, this great void, which is the light of self-reflection, because in that void, you cannot know the self as an object. You have to be the self. And so when we are in that void, Bagalamukhi is that stillness and the silence of that void. And so that is where this understanding, this actualization of who we really are becomes more of a stable kind of an experience. So, and this is where that, the turiya, or the witnessing awareness, we see that it is in this turiya that all these three bodies that we had talked about, the gross body, the subtle body, the causal body, the three granthis, remember, the Brahma Granthi, the Vishnu Granthi, and the Rudra Granthi, and the 5 sheets that we just talked about, all of these things actually appear in that clarity of the void, which is Bagalamukhi. And so when we ask for her mace to strike us, so what she does, that mace actually stills the noise of all of the 5 sheets. So it helps us to see, where our problems lie, where our obstructions are to this kind of liberating understanding. And so Dhumavati, as we saw last class, she forces us to look at, face this darkness that is within us. But Bagalamukhi shows us really what it is, what it means to surrender to that void, to that darkness, in our day-to-day lives, to surrender to what is, instead of hanging on to what should be. So, and on a more practical level, Bagalamukhi actually, we can look at her action in the brain. In neuroscience, there have been 2 distinct pathways that have been discovered. So they are called one is called the task positive network, and the other is the default network, the default mode network. So the task positive network is the one that is active when we are engaged in a particular action. So as I'm talking to you and you are listening to me, if you're really listening to me, then the task positive network is active because you are involved in a task. So this happens, right, if you are deeply engaged in a task, writing or working or painting or cooking or whatever it may be. When you're engaged in that, that is the task positive network. Now, there's another network in the brain which is called the default mode network. So when we are not engaged in a task, then this is the network that is active. So when you go about your days in this next week, examine your thoughts and see whether this is true. And you'll find this to be true. When you are not focused on a task, all of your thoughts will be revolving around the I, the me. Everything revolves around the me. Okay, so this is actually a very fun experiment that you can see at any minute, when any moment when you have a particular thought that is going on in your head. um, just pause and examine that, and you'll see what is it centering around. Right, it is this self-preservation. So this is the DMN, or the default mode network, is the network of the I self. So this is how the I self stays alive, by constant reference to itself in the form of this default mode network. So these thoughts basically have no purpose. They don't result in any meaningful action. And it's just this constant rumination, right from the time we wake up all the way to until we are in deep sleep. And so these are the thoughts that have to do with memory. They have to do with the imagination about the past, about the future. The thoughts that keep you up at night. They really serve no purpose. But it's just meaningless thoughts, and they come from the default mode network. So they revolve around validating the I self, the justifying the I self, what I should have done, what he should have done, what somebody else should have done, what somebody else should do, and what the outcome of an action should be, should not have been, and the what ifs, the I hope not, that really have no relevance at all whatsoever to the present moment. Right. So when these thoughts are active, that intellect sheath, remember I said the Vijnanamaya Kosha, it is completely clouded, and you have no ability to see who you really are. Right. And it's just, and these thoughts are called blah blah thoughts, because they truly are blah blah thoughts. They have really no meaning at all. So these blah blah thoughts, on the other hand, although they're completely meaningless, they are the ones that are responsible for our suffering. They are the ones that are responsible for our anxiety. And they are the culmination, really, of all the shadows of all the Mahavidyas. Right? So, and if you really inquire into it, you'll be able to see that. So, on the spiritual journey, these blah blah thoughts are very interesting to note. So here on the spiritual journey, what happens is that we collect all this spiritual information, right? The knowledge that we accumulate, we are constantly learning, and we are, now we have an idea of what we as spiritual practitioners should be doing, how we should be feeling, and how we should be processing things. But that's really not what is going on. Right? We are still processing things in a different way. But you see the dichotomy between what we should be doing and what is actually happening. And that comes from this accumulation of this knowledge, right? So a lot of times this learning is needed, right? We start off on a path based on guidance from others, like our teachers and our gurus and the teachings and so on. But all the paths have an inherent trap. And that is this idea of what the goal should be, what our end result is going to look like, right? So what we do is that we keep chasing what that should be, and really lose track of what is. And this very knowledge that we have cultivated have now become our new blah blah thoughts. So if your old blah blah thoughts that revolved around he should have said this, she should have said this, have simply evolved into new blah blah thoughts, which is, I shouldn't be feeling like this because now I'm a spiritual practitioner. Look at me. I've been on this path for 10 years and I'm still feeling like this. Or I am so stupid. I should have known better. I mean, I shouldn't be feeling anxious. No, I should be doing pranayama. Should I be doing pranayama? No, I should be doing asana. No, maybe not. I should really be focusing on meditation. You see? Blah, blah thoughts. So somewhere along the way, we completely become invested So we start off on this path wanting the moon. And then we come across the fingers pointing to the moon. What are these fingers? The teachers, the teachings, the company we keep. And along the way, the moon is completely gone from our interest. What we become solely interested in are these fingers pointing to the moon. So we become so invested in this finger that where it's pointing, that moon is forgotten. And we rest in this, this clutter of the mind. And that is really the biggest shadow of Bagalamukhi. That mind clutter, that inability to discern and know the difference between the moon and the finger. So then, this is a very innocent trap that we fall into. We come to love the teacher, and we come to love the teaching so much that the purpose of the teacher or the teaching is lost. Whereas the teacher is saying, hey, who you are is no different from me, we become completely invested in the teacher as this ideal, as this, somebody to worship and to idolize, and lose sight of what they are actually pointing to. So that is actually a very big trap on the spiritual path. And it is, the more advanced you are on this spiritual path, the greater is this potential for this shadow. And it is that process in which we change the I self changes from being a materialist to being a spiritual materialist. So we may not want the big house and the big car and all that, but we want big spiritual experiences. We want to be known in certain ways and validated in certain ways. So we just simply shed one one sheath and put on another one. Instead of losing those, clarifying those sheaths, we just simply change its avatar. That's it. So we really need to be extremely discerning at this point in our sadhana, because it is so easy and so difficult. And the more spiritual you become, the greater is this inner conflict. Should I eat that or not? I wonder if it's spiritual to have, I don't know, like soup instead of a salad. A spiritual person should be eating a salad. Should I wear these clothes? Would I appear more spiritual if I wear this? Now, if I talk like this, am I more spiritual? You see? So all of these, these garbs, these kinds of clutter we cultivate and collect into our 5 sheets, this is what dulls that. The golden Hiranya Varna becomes dull and yellow. And that is that great shadow of Bagalamukhi. So when we call upon Bagalamukhi, she basically stuns and silences the clutter of this conflict within the mind. And she basically stills all these mental modifications we have with a loss of reference to memory, which is the past, or imagination, that is the future. So what she does is, when she stills these 5 sheets, we basically lose our reference points, which means we lose the ability to refer to knowledge. So that's when real awakening begins. As long as we are hanging on to intellectual knowledge, there can be no real awakening. Okay? So once the work has been done with the intellectual knowledge, once you have understood it, then it needs to go. If you hang on to it, then that becomes clutter. So this is that gift of grace that I was talking about earlier, which results in the stilling of the mind that is needed to part those subtle veils, the final veils that cover the self. And um, if we really want to know something, if we really want to know and stand as that knowing, the sacrifice we have to make is of knowledge, of that speech. And so remember, I was equating speech with knowledge earlier. So the sacrifice is that knowledge and the speech. So Bagalamukhi takes away that speech, which means she takes away that ability to refer to knowledge. And what she gives us in return is this gift of absolute silence. And she enables us to see that even the I self that is wanting to surrender is itself a problem. The I self wanting to surrender is the problem, because the I self cannot really surrender itself, right? It's not a fool, because it's not going to surrender itself. The surrendering happens by seeing that the I self isn't really a solid object that can be found anywhere. It is just a temporary arising where in Turiya, in this witnessing awareness, which is Bagalamukhi herself. So, how do we invoke Bagalamukhi? How do we work with this great goddess? So, as a side story, Bagalamukhi was my introduction to the Mahavidyas. Before her, I had really no idea about who these Mahavidyas were. And when I was initiated into Sri Vidya, I heard that my guru at the time was giving the Diksha or initiation into Bagalamukhi. And I read up a little bit about her on his website. And I said, well, this sounds interesting. I want to do this. And so I wrote to him. I wrote to my guru and I said, I want this Diksha. And he didn't give it. He said, you have to write an essay and tell me why you want it. So this was many years ago. And so I wrote an essay and I said, well, I'm tired of my mind and I want her to still it. And he liked that a lot. Actually, he highlighted that and he sent it back to me and said, okay, I will initiate you in Bagalamukhi. And even now, this mantra, Bagalamukhi mantra, is something that comes up to me every time, my mind gets cluttered with unnecessary things, the blah, blah thoughts. That mantra just arises. And immediately there is a stilling of the mind. And but the way to invoke Bagalamukhi, is by this process of decluttering. So in this week's homework, actually, there is a whole section on decluttering. So please spend some time. It's, over this week, thinking about decluttering. And so when we're thinking about decluttering, we are thinking about our physical space or our closets or our drawers or whatever. And that's all part of it. There is a whole section on that. But the real decluttering needs to happen in the mind. It needs to happen in our perception, in the way we analyze and the way we cognize our sensations and our perceptions. So, and that, of course, comes through this daily practice of deep meditation. So when you sit down day in, day out, twice a day and meditate, Bagalamukhi's gift actually starts to shine through in this inner silence. And without that inner silence, none of the other practices actually catch hold of us. And so that inner silence is like the most important ingredient. And one of the practices that I particularly love for decluttering my mind and the psyche and these 5 sheets is the practice of samyama. So samyama is this very beautiful practice from the Yoga Sutras, which is a culmination actually of the last 3 limbs of yoga as described by Patanjali. So it is, the last 3 limbs are dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So dharana is concentration, dhyana is meditation, and samadhi, as we have seen before, is the absorption of the object of meditation into the meditator. So where the subject and the object become one. And so there is a very powerful way of practicing samyama, where you bring together these three, the three limbs, and it's a little bit different than meditation, because in meditation, for instance, if you're doing the bliss meditation, you'll see that you basically touch upon you are bringing more and more subtlety to the mantra. So the mantra is going inward, so to speak. So it's effortless, and again you bring your attention back to the mantra, where it automatically becomes very refined and very subtle and fuzzy, and then suddenly you are thrown out of that object or the mantra, and you are absorbed in samadhi. So in samyama, it's a little bit different, because when you are already in that meditative state, then what you do is you take a word or a phrase, and typically these are called samyama sutras, and there are different teachings for samyama. The one that I have taught and I have practiced is the one from AYP, or Advanced Yoga Practices, which has 9 sutras, and these are English words. So basically you in that meditative state, you touch upon that word. So what that means is, for instance, if the word is love, you're not really thinking about the stories about love. You just evoke that what that love brings up for you. But it isn't like a relationship or anything like that. Just the word, what, very briefly, like you just touch upon what it evokes, and then you go back to silence. And then 15 seconds later, you do that again. You bring up that word, and then you go back to silence. And so what happens with this kind of a practice over time, nothing happens immediately, but what happens when you do this practice is that that word or that phrase is amplified in silence. So it is amplified and basically expands in the silence, where it comes out through us, because it gets refined in our system, and it refines our system, and it begins to manifest in our lives in very miraculous ways. So I have always thought, for instance, that the whole point of these yogic practices, the Raja Yoga practices like meditation and pranayama and everything, is to practice samyama, because it's such a powerful practice. And it is described as a practice that gives us these supernormal powers like siddhis. But what Yogani from Advanced Yoga Practices says is that you cannot possibly misuse that. Because here you are giving up. Basically, samyama is a practice of surrender. You are bringing up this very subtle evocation of that phrase, and then you're giving it up into silence. You're surrendering it into silence. So, and then basically you're giving it up and saying, whatever way this silence, this great silence, the void, is going to manifest this as, is fine. So, that is the attitude with which we approach samyama. And so when we approach that, and when we give that up, when we surrender that, there is no possible way that you're going to be bestowed with a power to harm anybody. So this is not the kind of tapas that the asuras did, because that was a different kind of tapas where they are, single pointedly asking for a certain boon. So this is a more holistic and a more of a loving, heart-centered way of doing this tapas kind of a practice. So let's try this. So refresh your posture. Sit with your spine erect. And close your eyes. Take a deep breath. And exhale. Now let go of the breath. Don't try to control it. But just observe your breath. Just observe the sensation of the breath as the air enters your nostrils. What does it feel like in the back of your throat? What happens to your abdomen as you breathe in? What happens to it as you breathe out? Just observe your breath. Every time your mind wanders, gently bring it back to the breath. Now let go of the attention on the breath. And just rest in the silence. Now just briefly think of the word love and observe what it evokes in you. And let go and come back to the silence. We're not ruminating over love. We're not thinking about the stories about love. Just touch it. Feel what it evokes and come back to silence. Let's do that again. Love. Now let's think of the word radiance. Again, think the word, allow it to bring up whatever it's going to bring up, and come back to silence. Once again, radiance. Now think the word unity. Unity. Now take a deep breath. And exhale. Come back here to the body, to where you're sitting. To your hands and feet and face. Take another deep breath. And exhale. And open your eyes. So this was just a very brief practice of samyama. If you're going to practice this, make sure you do right after meditation. So meditate for 20 minutes and then do the samyama practice for about 5 minutes. That's how long it'll take if you do the 9 sutras that are in the book, taking about 15 seconds between just 2 repetitions of each sutra. And basically, again, to reiterate, we're not contemplating on the meaning of the word. We just drop that feeling of that sutra in the stillness, allow it to basically expand and radiate outward. And so what we're doing here is we're letting go of the knowledge of the sutra, that meaning of the sutra. And in that letting go, it becomes that expands and becomes refined and becomes absorbed in the silence and then starts manifesting in our life. And as we become more and more established in the samyama practice, you'll see that all of life just starts to flow in a stream of miracles and synchronicities. So all the thoughts and the emotions and doership, all of this are, it starts getting released in that expanding stillness. And then all of life starts becoming like worship and surrender. And so that is like the greatest gift of Bagalamukhi. So she silences all of our points of reference and of these shoulds and should nots that arise from speech and knowledge, and it that true knowing, the grace of true knowing is really what she prepares us for, this great goddess Bagalamukhi. So at this point, I'll stop here and see if you have any questions.